let's revisit one of my favorite handheld consoles ever, the Sony PlayStation Portable or PSP. Originally released in 2004, the PSP was innovative, bringing for the first time handheld performance that significantly narrowed the gap between home consoles and handhelds. Before the PSP, ports to handhelds were often restricted to 2D due to the limitations of hardware, and while the Game Boy and GBA certainly had games that punched above their weight, this was the exception rather than the rule. Sony would change all that with the PSP, a very capable handheld that could handle fast 3D thanks to its MIPS R4000 CPU and its media engine that could offload and handle different tasks in hardware. The PSP was a game changer and even offered an optical disc drive known as the UMD drive for the very first time and last time ever in a handheld. Looking back, the UMD drive was an interesting design choice, but the choices that were made cannot be disputed, with the PSP selling over 80 million systems worldwide as of 2022 and giving birth to the PS Vita, which, like the PSP, was in many ways before its time. Now, of course, the PSP was a system that had the attention of hackers, and it wouldn't be long before the system was hacked to run homebrew and illegal backups. We've covered the entire history of PSP security and the cat and mouse game between Sony and the scene. And if you want to know more, or you've heard the name Dark Alex before, I made a video around 3 years ago, and I'll leave a link to that in the description below. But the big takeaway here from this is that the PSP was almost the perfect handheld. The PSP was cool and could play many games, some of them built exclusively for the hardware. Many third parties also worked on big games for the PSP, none bigger than Rockstar with Liberty Cities and Vice City Stories to name two. Sony had managed to offer nearly the power of the PlayStation 2 in the palm of your hand. The system would also let you watch movies, connect to the internet, play and listen to various media formats, as well as connect to a PS3 and control it via remote play. But there was more. The underground homebrew scene. With the PSP being exploited pretty much from day one, the homebrew scene moved fast, and just like the original Xbox homebrew days, the PSP scene was thriving. And the good news is, even to this day in 2023, the PSP is still such a great handheld for homebrew. First of all, picking up a PSP is dirt cheap, especially the old PSP 1000 models. You can play native PSP games, of course, as well as backward compatible PS1 titles, and then bundle in most 8 and 16-bit emulators as well as the Nintendo 64, add some quality ports and original homebrew titles, and you have a very great handheld. Not only this, the battery life of the PSP, especially if you weren't accessing the UMD drive, could last you up to 5 hours or so on a single charge when playing games. Compare this to the Steam Deck or ROG Ally, and you've got one hell of a handheld. Now, if you do have a PSP and you've had one sitting in your closet or in your bedroom drawer for many, many years, and you're thinking that it's mostly a paperweight these days, well, it may be worth revisiting your PlayStation Portable or PSP, or even for the first time picking one up. They're very cheap on eBay, and with a little bit of money, you can actually pimp out one of these PSPs really nicely and give it some awesome quality of life. Let's go ahead and check out some of the things that I'm talking about. Now, the first update you want to do is to replace your PSP battery first and foremost. Your old existing battery probably will no longer work or hold charge, and in some cases I've seen very much expanded batteries that kind of poke out of the back of the case, and this is definitely not something that you want to keep around. So throw it out and buy a replacement. Now, you can get a replacement battery that's 3600 milliamp hours, and that'll cost you around 10 to $8 on eBay. And I recommend this one personally, as I've been using this one for the last couple of weeks, and it has a longer charge than I remember. Now, there's various schools of thoughts around whether you should replace it with an official OEM battery or just buy a cheap knockoff. And in my experience, this $8, $9 battery works just fine. Now, be aware of the PSP model that you have and make sure that you purchase the right battery for your model. But the takeaway here is, guys, if you have an original PSP and you want to use it in 2023, then please take out the original battery and replace it. Now, before we proceed, the next thing that you really want to do to your PSP, once you have a new battery and you've got your system back up and running, assuming that you have some memory card installed on your PSP, is to mod it for homebrew. And this is something that I recommend anyone out there do with a PSP that you have. In fact, many kind of secondhand or used PSPs that you purchase on the market on reseller websites will probably be already modded in some capacity. But if not, then I do recommend that you reach out to a guide on the internet. And the best one that I can find, at least of the making of this episode, is the website pspunk.com. Now, this particular website will walk through every facet of exploiting your PSP, including updating your firmware. Now, the first thing that you want to do if you're not on the latest firmware 6.61 is to get it updated to 6.61. So this website not only offers a guide and a download for the firmware so you can update your PSP to 6.61, it also offers the homebrew and exploit tools for you to exploit your PSP. So I definitely recommend this website. I'll leave a link to it in the description below, but just a quick disclaimer, these types of websites tend to get updated once in a while when some new exploit is found, or potentially Sony could, for no apparent reason, just update the PSP firmware. We've definitely seen things like that happen with the PlayStation 3, for example. So there's always the danger that these guides will go out of date. But for now, pspunk.com is the place you want to go to learn how to exploit your PlayStation Portable. Now, having your PSP modded for homebrew and having a custom firmware is probably one of the most important things that you can do, because now once you have that in place, you can now start to use a micro SD adapter. Now, back in the day, PSP memory storage, if you recall, using the Memory Stick Pro format was very expensive. I think, like a 4 gig or an 8 gig card was quite pricey. Now, obviously, storage is much cheaper these days, and the good news is there are adapters out there that will take the Memory Stick Pro Duo format and allow you just to put a regular SD card in. Now, I believe you can go as high as 2 terabytes with a particular custom firmware. I haven't actually tested that before, but the one that I have here has a 64 gigabyte SD card, and this, for all intents and purposes, is plenty of storage for me to load up pretty much any game, emulator, ROMs, whatever I want on my PSP, and have tons and tons of room to spare. But I definitely recommend that you pick up a Memory Stick Pro Duo micro SD adapter. Once again, just like the battery, these things are very cheap, and I'll leave relevant links in the description below so you can get set up with this as well. Now, the last mod that I've done to my PSP here is to replace the screen with an IPS panel. Now, I will say straight off the bat that this will only work, at least of the making of this episode, with the PSP 1000. I don't believe there are IPS panel replacements for anything other than the PSP 1000, but that's not really a bad thing, because the PSP 1000, for all intents and purposes, the screen hasn't aged particularly well. Not only is it quite dull, especially when you compare it to, say, the PSP 3000 or even the PSP Go, it also has a really bad side effect of blurring when there is a lot of pixels being moved around quite fast. And this is quite apparent, especially when you play 2D games. Now, the good news is this particular IPS panel only cost me $25 from AliExpress. Now, I will say that this is not a drop-in panel replacement that doesn't require soldering. It certainly does. And it's something that I think you can either get someone to do it for yourself. I've also seen pre-built models on eBay for sale, PSPs that have the panel replacement installed. Or if you are experienced with soldering, you could do it yourself. This is not a particular complicated job, but it does require you opening up your PSP and doing a panel replacement, and it does require to use a soldering iron. But the end result is that it offers the best looking PSP 1000 screen that I've ever seen. The colors are very accurate. The brightness is quite high. I think it's kind of rated around 350 nits. And overall, the ghosting on this IPS panel is almost non-existent. It's still definitely there, but it is a lot less noticeable. And as a comparison, take a look at the difference between my stock PSP 1000 on the bottom and the IPS panel on top. I'm absolutely in love with this particular panel. It's a really cheap upgrade as well. And look, some people don't really care for aftermarket IPS panel replacements, but I think a PSP 1000 is definitely in need for something like this. And I would recommend, if you do have the know-how on how to do this, then check this out as well. I'll leave a link to the panel that I have purchased on AliExpress in the description below as well. But definitely check this out, because for me, this is really the star of the show, and it just brings new life to my PSP 1000 all those years later. So now that we've well and truly pimped out our Sony PlayStation Portable, what can we do with this in 2023? Well, there is, as mentioned, a really great homebrew community on the PSP. Now, there is a lot of things that are kind of legacy that haven't been updated in many years, but the scene always continues with new advancements. Now, of course, there are emulators that you can download and play, including pretty much anything from the 8 and 16-bit era, including many different home computers as well. So we've got Super NES, Sega Genesis, NES, Game Boy Color, GBA, all those favorites, all those things that, have always worked for a very long time. But I'm slowly starting to see there's been some advancements in kind of homebrew ports and other interesting things that have happened over the last few years. The first one is the Super Mario 64 decompilation project is available on the PSP. Now, this thing is absolutely incredible. The fact that we're playing the decompilation project on a PSP is mind-blowing to me, and it looks great. It runs well. It's not perfect. There's definitely slowdown, and it seems like there's kind of some stutter that goes on as well, kind of during random times, but overall very playable and a great experience. And this thing absolutely looks incredible on the IPS panel that I've installed in this PSP 1000 as well. But definitely check out the Super Mario 64 decompilation on the PSP. It's definitely a must-have. I also checked out Quake for PSP, and I gotta say, I think this has been around for a while now. This is definitely not new homebrew, but I'm quite surprised at how well Quake does run on the PSP. This is very well optimized code, and it feels great and it looks great. It runs at a solid frame rate, and props to the developers for bringing this one out, because this isn't something that I ever remember seeing on the PSP. So definitely check out Quake on the PSP if you are a fan of that style of game. Now, Daedalus X64 is a Nintendo 64 emulator that's been in development pretty much since 2004-2005, from pretty much the early days of PSP homebrew. And every so often, this emulator gets an update. And I gotta be honest, I didn't really give this much thought, and I kind of wrote it off as an emulator that hasn't really improved that much over the years, but I'm quite surprised at how well it actually does run on the Sony PSP. Now, of course, getting full speed N64 emulation on the PSP is very difficult to do. This emulator is nowhere near perfect, but given the fact that it's emulating a Nintendo 64 on a PlayStation Portable is quite impressive. And one thing that I probably recommend you do, if you do want to run N64 games on your PSP, I would say it's more of a passing curiosity than anything else. But if you do actually want to play games, I would recommend that you turn off the audio in the emulation, because that will give you a pretty significant frame rate boost, but you can still play with sound turned on. Just keep in mind that it will sound quite choppy and the frame rate will be lower than expected. The other update that I wanted to call out was OpenLara. Now, OpenLara is a fully reverse engineered Tomb Raider 1 and 2 engine that runs on various platforms. We covered it on the Game Boy Advance about a year ago, and this is the PSP version, and initial impressions are very good. This is running at 60 frames per second, and it's silky smooth. So having those original Tomb Raider 1 and 2 games on the PSP is a really nice touch. Props to the developer who made this port possible. I think this is one of the better homebrew releases that I've seen in quite some time. Now, there are various other homebrew and emulators that run on the PSP, and I'm going to just kind of give you a quick kind of B-roll of all the ones that I tested out here, but there's a lot here to cover, and I don't really want to go through all of them in this episode, mainly because there haven't really been any updates to this stuff in quite a while. But the last thing that I do want to mention is that now that we have a modded PSP and we have a significantly large memory card, we have 64 gigs in my particular system, you have the option now to no longer use the UMD drive to play your games. You can easily just rip your games from your UMD as ISO images. You can then just place those ISO images into the ISO folder on the root of your memory card. And automatically, when you go into your memory card on your PSP, assuming you have a 6.61 custom firmware, they will automatically show up as games that you can launch. And this means that now you've not only backed up your PSP library, you've preserved these games, but more importantly, you no longer require the UMD to actually play these games. And this can really help out with longer battery life, as well as general wear and tear on the UMD, which is notorious for both breaking down mechanically and to stop reading discs. So I definitely recommend that you look at doing this, getting your basically all the games that you want to play on your memory card and go from there. So there you have it. Updating your PSP in 2023, even though it sounds like a waste of time, really is something you may want to consider doing, especially when we see these like retro handheld knockoff devices that come out pretty much every week that have, 10,000 games on them that don't really run very well as far as emulation is concerned. Getting a hold of a PSP for cheap, a used one, replacing its battery, giving it a large memory card, replacing the screen. You can also replace the case as well and put a brand new case on it and make it look really, really nice. And loading it up full of your favorite PSP games and emulators and ROMs and homebrew is really something that is quite compelling for me in 2023. But we are going to leave it here for today's episode, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up. Have a fantastic week, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.